History has a way of shifting slowly but relentlessly. For over half a century, the story written in the global economy was a story written in Washington, D.C. It was an era of undisputed America's-led world order. While the West has spent the last 2 decades focused on immediate election cycles, quarterly earnings, and short-term consumer trends, Beijing has been playing a different game, a long game. One designed not just to compete with the United States, but to eventually bypass it entirely.
Two opposing leadership styles.
The global economy is currently being reshaped by two fundamental opposing philosophies of power. The contrast between Washington and Beijing is no longer just ideological, it is operational. In the United States, foreign policy under Donald Trump is built on deliberate unpredictability, relying on public ultimatums and social media threats. This approach views geopolitical alliance through the short-term, transactional lens, actively dismantling the multilateral systems that anchored the West for 6 decades. While many of these threats never materialized, functioning instead as opening salvos for a deal, they introduce massive systemic risk for global markets. Directly across this chasm stands Xi Jinping, whose doctrine relies on institutional consistency. Free from the pressure of short-term election cycles, Beijing plays the long game. By projecting an image of stoic stability, Xi has positioned China as the self-proclaimed adult in the room, a reliable partner stepping directly into the vacuum left by American volatility. When the US threats historic alliance as short-term business deals, it severely erodes American soft power.
It seems that every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must.
Nations watching from the outside see a Washington whose foreign policy could completely reverse every 4 years, and a Beijing whose strategic goal will remain identically 20 years from now.
Biggest economies like G3, China, US, and EU, EU and China, UK and China has to work together to maintain the global order. Of course, China is the signatory, the first signatory of UN Charter, and then China is the strongest defender and supporter of global system, of United Nations. China is the largest donor of UN peacekeeping budget now. China actually is the second largest donor of whole UN budget.
By simply maintaining a predictable linear path, China is quietly convincing the world that it is the inevitable anchor of the next century. The divergence between time horizon leadership has a strong impact for the future of the US economy and global world order. But how did China reach the point of threatening US dominance?
Economic Convergence.
For more than 3/4 of a century, global economic history has been defined by a single constant. Since 1950, the United States has maintained undisputed economic hegemony, acting as the anchor of the global financial system. Yet beneath this American baseline, the rest of global leaderboard has been in constant state of flux. No nation has navigated this shift more aggressively than China. Following the structural reforms of the late 1990s, Beijing began an unprecedented economic convergence. By 2010, China officially displaced Japan to become the world's second largest economy, a position it has systematically consolidated ever since. To understand the sheer velocity of this rise, we have to look at the relative weight of the two superpowers. In the year 2000, China's gross domestic product was equivalent to just 13% of the US economy. Over the next 2 decades, this gap dissolved. By 2020, the Chinese economy had expanded to absorb a massive 75% of America's economic weight. This historic compression raises an inevitable question for global markets. When will China overtake the United States? Wall Street and global institutions are currently divided in the exact timeline of this flipping point. Goldman Sachs has historically modeled an aggressive trajectory, forecasting that China will surpass the US by 2035, its economic lead widening through the subsequent decades. Conversely, the OECD offers a more conservative outlook. Their projection pushed this timeline out to 2050, predicting that China will reach near parity with the United States before hitting a structural plateau. the underlying geopolitical reality remains unchanged. The unipolar economic world is over. But how did a nation once isolated from global markets reach this inflection point? And more importantly, what structural levers could actually propel Beijing to the position of global economic leadership?
The supply chain moat.
In the late 20th century, the US exported its manufacturing base to China. The logic was simple. Cheaper labor force meant cheaper goods for Americans and higher margins for US companies. But this model has long-term consequences. By moving the physical act of making things overseas, the US didn't just blue-collar jobs. It lost part of its influence in the ecosystem of innovation. In industry, innovation happens on the factory floor. When you outsource the making, you eventually outsource part of the thinking process. Trump has tried to battle this through two different trade wars. And although in the last one, China's export to the US fell about 20% in 2025, its position as global exporter keeps increasing. Exports to India jumped 12%. To Southeast Asian countries, they rose 13.5%. And to the EU, up 8.4%. In the end, China had a record trade surplus hitting $1.2 trillion. Today, China doesn't just assemble your iPhone. They control the processing of 80% of the world's rare earth minerals, which are used into tech devices, EV lithium batteries, and military aircraft and weapons. So, what does this mean for Western citizens? It means the future of consumption and transport in America are now robbed to Chinese industrial policies. If you're an American consumer, your ability to buy an affordable electric vehicle or even a high-end laptop is no longer dictated by Silicon Valley, but by the stability of a supply chain that begins and ends in China. The long game here wasn't about cheap labor, but about creating a global dependency that the US cannot easily replicate. But not only that, all the industrial policies and international trade dynamics has an impact into the global monetary order.
The end of the Exorbitant Privilege.
Since 1945, the US dollar has been the world's reserve currency. This gave America what economists call an exorbitant privilege, the ability to borrow money cheaply and print currency that the rest of the world is forced to hold. China's long game involved a slow, methodical de-dollarization. In the Belt and Road Initiative, they are encouraging nations to trade in the yuan. China is strategically building a global gold vault network, with key hubs in Saudi Arabia, aiming at reinforcing their global trade alliance, particularly oil trade. For decades, the US dollar has been the global reserve currency and the one used for global trade. Therefore, the world needed dollars. So a big part of the global liquidity was stored in US dollars denominated stable assets, aka US Treasury bills and bonds. Americans have enjoyed artificially low interest rates and relatively low inflation because of the dollar status. If this status slips, interest rates of your mortgage will go up. The price of imported coffee, gas, and clothes will rise permanently. A government that can no longer rely on the world to buy its debt will be forced to either cut service or raise taxes significantly. The long game here isn't a military invasion, it's a financial displacement. But despite the trade and monetary wins against Trump, China has internal issues its industrial success can't hide.
China's internal struggles.
To the outside world, China appears as an unstoppable monolith, but internally, the Communist Party is fighting a three-front economic war and facing a concerning political issue. About the three economic problems. First, there is the real estate bubble. For decades, property accounted for nearly 30% of China's GDP. That engine has stalled. Today, millions of Chinese citizens have their life savings locked in ghost cities, apartments that may never be finished, in cities that may never be full. This has triggered the second economic problem, a massive slump in domestic consumption. When your primary source of wealth, your home, loses value, people simply stop spending. And thirdly, The most explosive one is youth unemployment. Low-end factory jobs are being offshored to Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines in search of even cheaper labor. On the manufacturing jobs that remained, a third of workers have been moved to flexible shifts, a polite term for underemployment. For the record number of university graduates, the situation is even grimmer. We are seeing cases in the Hangzhou court of illegal dismissals, where the companies are allegedly firing human workers to replace them with AI systems. Beijing is caught in a paradox. They want to build a national end-to-end AI infrastructure to maintain their tech lead, yet the government is simultaneously braking to avoid getting unemployment rate worse. They've recently restricted licenses for robotaxis and other autonomous systems, fearing that if AI displaces workers too quickly, the resulting social unrest could threaten the party's grip of power. This brings us to the internal political problem that haunts every long-term projection for China, the succession shadow. Since 2018, when Xi Jinping abolished presidential term limits, he has become the most powerful leader since Mao Zedong. But power concentrated in one man creates a single point of failure. Under Chinese Communist Party tradition, a successor must be groomed for 5 years, chosen from a specific tier of the party, and typically aged between 50 and 60 to ensure a stable transition. The problem? Right now, there's no successor. The officials currently in the pipeline are roughly the same age as Xi himself, 72 years old. For the global economy, this creates extreme volatility. History shows that when a centralized power lacks an orderly transition plan, the result is often internal power struggles or external aggressions to distract from domestic growth. If China's internal engine fails, the long game might become a desperate game. For American citizens, a China in crisis is arguably more dangerous than a China in growth. It means more supply chain shocks, more unpredictable trade wars, and a global partner that is suddenly fighting for its own survival. China is indeed winning many battles, but as these internal pressures mount, the question isn't whether they can overtake the US, it's whether they can stay together long enough to try. So, is China winning?
The wake-up call.
In the metrics of industrial capacity, strategic patience, and infrastructure, the data suggests a clear yes. They have successfully moved from being a participant in the global system to being a key piece of the entire engine. On the other hand, low employment rate among young population driving internal headwinds on the AI development makes it lag on the AI race. In conclusion, this isn't a story of inevitable decline for the United States. The long game is only lost if you stop playing. For America, the era of taking global dominance for granted is over. The future now depends on whether the US can move past short-term distractions and reinvest in its own foundation, education, manufacturing, and the long-term vision of its own. The game is still being played. The question is, which side is looking further ahead? That's all for today. I'm Alex Ben, and you've been watching Flamecast. See you soon in the next episode.